For 15 years, he'd been Old Bob, the gun shop owner who told hunting stories and helped customers fill out paperwork. Everyone in town thought his steady sales came from fair prices and honest advice. They didn't know it came from someone who understood weapons better than anyone alive. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful tale of hidden expertise and deadly precision, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These narratives honor the warriors who never stopped protecting. Hayes Gun Shop sat on Main Street in Millbrook, a small mountain town where hunting was a way of life and gun ownership was as common as pickup trucks. The shop had been serving hunters, sport shooters, and law enforcement for over 30 years, first under the previous owner, then under Robert Hayes, who'd bought the business in 2009 after what he described as finishing up some government work. At 73, Bob Hayes looked exactly like what you'd expect from a small-town gun shop owner. Medium height, silver hair, wearing flannel shirts and jeans that had seen better days. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints reminded him daily that he wasn't young anymore, and he wore reading glasses that hung from a chain around his neck. But Bob had something that set him apart from other shop owners, an encyclopedic knowledge of firearms that went far beyond what most gun enthusiasts possessed. He could identify any weapon by sound, diagnose mechanical problems that stumped other gunsmiths, and recommend exactly the right ammunition for any purpose. Customers drove from 3 counties away to get Bob's advice on everything from deer hunting rifles to competition pistols. What impressed people most was Bob's patience with new gun owners. He'd spend hours explaining safety procedures, proper maintenance, and marksmanship fundamentals to anyone who asked. He was particularly careful with young hunters, making sure they understood not just how to shoot, but when not to shoot. His shop had become an unofficial training ground for the area's youth, and parents trusted Bob to teach their children the respect that firearms demanded. The local police relied on Bob's expertise as well. When they needed specialty ammunition or had questions about ballistics, they came to Hayes Gun Shop. When evidence included unfamiliar weapons, Bob could usually identify them from photographs. The sheriff often joked that Bob knew more about guns than their entire force combined. But Bob was modest about his knowledge, always deflecting compliments with humor. "I've just been around them a long time," he'd say, or, "You pick things up when you're interested in something." He never elaborated on where he'd learned what he knew, and people respected his privacy. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Bob Hayes remained something of a mystery. The younger crowd in town sometimes found Bob's careful approach frustrating. They wanted to talk about the latest tactical gear, the newest military-style rifles, the kind of equipment they'd seen in movies and video games. Bob would listen politely, answer their questions accurately, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he took a different view of such things than they did. "Old Bob's too serious about everything," some of the teenagers would say. "It's just guns, not rocket science." They'd mimic his careful way of handling firearms, his insistence on proper protocols, his reluctance to discuss the cool applications of various weapon systems. To them, he seemed overly cautious, maybe even scared of the very products he sold. What they didn't understand was that Bob's caution came from experience they couldn't imagine. His careful handling came from years when a mistake with a weapon meant someone didn't go home. His knowledge came from training that most civilians would never receive, and his respect for firearms came from seeing what they could do in the wrong hands. Robert Hayes had been Gunnery Sergeant Robert Hayes, United States Marine Corps, for 23 years. He'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Lebanon, and 1 in the Persian Gulf. But more importantly for his current situation, he'd spent 8 years as a Marine Corps marksmanship instructor, training snipers and precision shooters at Camp Pendleton and Quantico. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes had been responsible for turning ordinary Marines into weapon specialists capable of making impossible shots under combat conditions. He had developed training protocols that were still used by the Corps, written manuals on long-range shooting that were classified for decades, and personally trained some of the most skilled marksmen in military history. But all of that was a lifetime ago. Now he was just Bob, the gun shop owner who helped local hunters sighten their rifles and sold ammunition to weekend shooters. He'd found peace in the routine of civilian life and helping people pursue their hobbies safely and responsibly. The only violence he dealt with now was the kind that came from hunting accidents or improper storage, problems that could be solved with education rather than firepower. The afternoon of November 8th started typically. Bob opened the shop at 10 a.m., checked his inventory, and began preparing for the pre-hunting season rush that always brought increased business. Several customers had appointments to pick up rifles that had been serviced, and he expected the usual steady stream of people buying ammunition and accessories. Around 1 p.m., a group of 3 young men entered the shop. Bob didn't recognize them as locals, which wasn't unusual. Hunters came from all over the region, especially during peak season. But something about their behavior immediately put him on alert. They weren't looking at the merchandise the way hunters or sport shooters did. They were scanning the shop like people casing a target. The leader of the group was maybe 25, with gang tattoos visible on his neck and hands. He approached the counter with the swagger of someone who was used to intimidating people through size and attitude. His 2 companions spread out, positioning themselves near the exits in a way that Bob recognized as tactical movement. "Afternoon, old man," the leader said, his tone carrying casual disrespect. "Nice little shop you got here. Must do pretty good business selling all these guns to rednecks and wannabe soldiers." Bob nodded politely, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. "Can I help you gentlemen find something specific?" The man laughed, looking back at his companions. "Yeah, you can help us. We're going to need you to open that safe in the back, and we're going to need all the cash from your register. Think of it as a donation to some folks who need it more than you do." Bob's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, something so subtle that only someone with tactical training would have noticed. His weight settled slightly onto the balls of his feet. His breathing deepened almost imperceptibly. His eyes began tracking all 3 men with the kind of precision that comes from years of combat experience. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Bob said quietly, "but I'd be happy to call someone who can help you with whatever you really need." The leader's smile disappeared. "Old man, I don't think you understand the situation here. My boys and I aren't asking, we're telling. Now open that safe, or we're going to have to make this a lot more unpleasant for everyone." That's when one of the companions made the mistake that changed everything. He pulled a pistol from his waistband, a cheap .38 revolver that he clearly didn't know how to handle properly. His grip was wrong, his stance was amateur, and he was holding it like he'd learned everything he knew from movies. Bob Hayes looked at that weapon and realized that 15 years of peaceful retirement had just ended. "Son," Bob said, his voice carrying a new quality that none of them had heard before. "You need to put that down right now." The young man waved the gun casually. "Shut up, old man. You ain't giving orders anymore." "Actually," Bob replied, and now his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd spent decades training Marines to handle exactly this kind of situation. "I am." What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. Bob's right hand moved to the loaded .45 pistol he kept secured beneath the counter, a movement so smooth and practiced that it seemed like one fluid motion. His left hand hit the silent alarm that would summon police, while his body shifted into a shooting stance that hadn't changed since his days at Quantico. The leader of the group was still processing Bob's change in demeanor when he found himself looking down the barrel of a weapon held by someone who clearly knew how to use it. "Gentlemen," Bob said, his voice now carrying the tone he'd once used to address Marine recruits who weren't following instructions properly. "You've made several tactical errors. First, you chose a target who's prepared for exactly this situation. Second, you're using weapons you don't understand against someone who understands them better than you ever will. And third, you assumed that age means weakness." The man with the .38 started to raise his weapon, but Bob's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't recommend that. At this range, with this weapon, I can put 3 rounds center mass before you can even get that barrel pointed in my direction. I've been doing this since before you were born, and I've never missed a target I intended to hit." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The 3 would-be robbers were beginning to understand that they hadn't walked into a routine robbery. They'd encountered something they weren't prepared for. "Now," Bob continued, his weapon never wavering, "here's what's going to happen. The gentleman with the .38 is going to place it very carefully on that counter, grip first. His friends are going to put their hands where I can see them, and all three of you are going to lie face down on the floor and wait for the police to arrive." "You crazy old bastard," the leader snarled. "There's three of us and one of you." Bob allowed himself a slight smile. "Son, I once held off an entire Viet Cong squad with nothing but a rifle and 40 rounds of ammunition. 3 punks with illegal weapons and no training? That's not a challenge. That's target practice." The man with the gun looked at his companions, clearly hoping for support. What he saw in their faces was the dawning realization that they'd severely miscalculated their target. Bob's training kicked in completely now. He was no longer the patient shop owner who helped customers with their purchases. He was Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, and he was dealing with a tactical situation that required precision, control, and the absolute certainty that comes from years of combat experience. "You have 10 seconds to comply," Bob said. "After that, I'm going to assume you intend to use that weapon, and I'm going to respond accordingly. I've been authorized to use deadly force in defense of myself and others, and I've never hesitated to do so when the situation required it." The .38 hit the counter with a metallic clang. When the police arrived 6 minutes later, they found 3 suspects lying face down with their hands behind their heads, and Bob Hayes sitting calmly behind his counter, his weapons secured and his paperwork ready. The officers knew Bob well enough to trust his assessment of the situation, and they took the suspects into custody without incident. Detective Martinez, who'd known Bob for years, couldn't hide his curiosity. "Bob, how'd you know exactly what to do? Most shop owners would have just handed over the money." Bob shrugged, adjusting his reading glasses. "I guess I watched too much TV." But Detective Martinez had noticed details that didn't come from television. Bob's positioning, his weapon handling, the way he'd maintained control of the situation. These were the actions of someone with professional training. "Bob," he said quietly, "I've been a cop for 15 years. And I've never seen anyone handle an armed robbery like that. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Bob looked at him for a moment, then walked to a frame hanging behind the counter that most customers assumed was just decoration. He turned it around, revealing a photograph of a young Marine in dress uniform, with ribbons that Detective Martinez recognized as combat decorations. "Gunnery Sergeant Robert Hayes, Marine Corps Marksmanship Unit," Bob said simply. 23 years of service, 8 years training snipers, retired 1994. Detective Martinez studied the photograph, then looked at Bob with new understanding. "How many people did you train?" "Couple hundred Marines. Some of them went on to do important work." "And you've been here all this time, just selling guns to hunters?" Bob smiled. "Detective, there's nothing just about helping people exercise their constitutional rights safely and responsibly. It's important work, even if it's not as exciting as what I used to do." The story spread through town quickly, but not in the way Bob had feared. Instead of treating him like a curiosity or a celebrity, the community embraced him with a new kind of respect. They understood now why he was so careful about safety, why he insisted on proper training, why he took firearms so seriously. Parents started bringing their children to Bob not just for hunting advice, but for lessons in responsibility and respect. Veterans who'd never felt comfortable discussing their service found someone who understood without judgment. Law enforcement began consulting with Bob on training and tactics, but Bob's approach to his business didn't change. He still sold guns responsibly, still insisted on background checks, still refused sales to anyone who didn't demonstrate proper knowledge and attitude. The only difference was that people now understood why his standards were so high. Young hunters who'd once mocked his careful approach started paying closer attention to his instruction. They realized that Bob's outdated methods came from experience they could never match, and that his insistence on safety and precision could make the difference between a successful hunt and a tragedy. The 3 would-be robbers were sentenced to federal prison on firearms charges. During their trial, they testified that they'd chosen Hayes' gun shop because they thought an elderly owner would be an easy target. They admitted they'd never expected to encounter someone with professional military training. Bob never spoke publicly about the incident, but he didn't hide his background anymore either. When asked about his military service, he'd answer honestly but briefly. When people thanked him for his service, he accepted their gratitude gracefully. Most importantly, Bob's reputation as a trainer grew throughout the region. Police departments sent officers to learn from him. Competitive shooters sought his advice. Military recruiters recommended that young people interested in marksmanship specialties visit Hayes' gun shop before enlisting. Bob Hayes had found a new way to serve his country by ensuring that the next generation of gun owners understood both the power and the responsibility that came with firearms. He was still training marksmen, just in a different uniform and for different purposes. The shop remained busy, but Bob was more selective about his customers. He could spot potential problems before they developed, and he had the authority to refuse service to anyone who didn't meet his standards. No one questioned his judgment anymore. On quiet afternoons, Bob would sometimes look at the photograph behind his counter and remember the young Marines he'd trained decades ago. Some had gone on to distinguished military careers, others had returned to civilian life and become productive citizens. All of them had learned from Gunnery Sergeant Hayes that marksmanship was about more than hitting targets. It was about discipline, responsibility, and the wisdom to know when not to shoot. Now, as old Bob, he was teaching the same lessons to a new generation. The uniform was different, but the mission remained the same, creating citizens who understood that with great power comes great responsibility. This story was brought to you by True Human Tales. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet expertise suggested hidden depths? Tell us about them in the comments below, and let us know what city you're watching from today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to support the channel. We honor the guardians who continue teaching, one lesson at a time.